They came home from Vietnam changed. Young men who had left as teenagers returned as something else, something harder, something broken in ways that were not always visible. They had nightmares that jolted them awake screaming. They heard helicopters in every passing aircraft. They saw enemies in crowds. They could not hold jobs, could not maintain relationships, could not sleep through the night. They drank to forget. They used drugs to numb the pain. Some became homeless, living on the streets, unable to function in a world that seemed alien after the war. Some turned violent, their anger erupting without warning. And some, unable to live with the memories and the pain, took their own lives. This is the story of Vietnam veterans and post-traumatic stress disorder, known as PTSD. It is a story of invisible wounds that were as real and as devastating as any physical injury. Wounds that the military and the nation were unprepared to recognize or treat. It is a story of men who served their country and came home to find themselves broken, struggling to survive in a society that did not understand what they had been through and did not want to hear about it. It is a story of suffering that continued for decades after the war ended, of families destroyed, of lives lost, of a generation of veterans who paid a price that extended far beyond their time in Vietnam. But this is also a story of recognition and healing, of the gradual understanding that psychological trauma is real and treatable, of the development of therapies and support systems that have helped many veterans, of the emergence of PTSD as a recognized medical condition that affects not just combat veterans, but anyone who experiences severe trauma. The story of Vietnam veterans and PTSD is tragic, but it has also led to increased knowledge about trauma and its treatment that has benefited millions of people beyond just veterans. To understand the PTSD crisis among Vietnam veterans, we must first understand the nature of the war they fought. Vietnam was unlike previous American wars in ways that made psychological trauma more likely and more severe. It was a guerrilla war where the enemy was often invisible, where civilians could be combatants, where there were no front lines and no safe rear areas. It was a war of ambushes and booby traps where soldiers were constantly on edge, never knowing when death would strike. It was a war where soldiers saw their friends killed and maimed by enemies they rarely saw, creating a sense of helplessness and rage. The average age of American soldiers in Vietnam was 19, younger than in any previous American war. Most were draftees who had not volunteered for military service and who did not want to be in Vietnam. They were sent to a foreign country whose language and culture they did not understand, to fight in a war whose purpose was unclear, against an enemy who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere. They were kids, really, thrown into adult. Situations of life and death, expected to kill and to risk being killed, expected to make impossible moral decisions under conditions of extreme stress. The nature of combat in Vietnam was particularly traumatic. In previous wars, soldiers might experience intense combat for days or weeks during major battles, but there were also periods of relative quiet between battles. In Vietnam, there was no respite. Every patrol could be the one that walked into an ambush. Every night could be the night the perimeter was attacked. Every step could be the one that triggered a mine. The constant stress, the hypervigilance required to survive, the inability to ever fully relax, all took a psychological toll that accumulated over time. The 12-month tour of duty, which was intended to be humane by giving soldiers a clear end date to their service in the combat zone, actually contributed to psychological problems. Soldiers did not deploy with their units and return with their units as in previous wars. Instead, they rotated individually, arriving in Vietnam alone and leaving alone. This meant they did not have the unit cohesion and continuity that helped soldiers cope with combat stress. It meant that as soldiers neared the end of their tours, they became increasingly anxious about surviving to go home, a phenomenon called short-timer syndrome. And it meant that soldiers arrived back in the United States within days of leaving combat, with no transition period, no time to decompress, no gradual readjustment to normal life. The homecoming experience for Vietnam veterans was unlike that of veterans from previous wars. World War II, veterans returned to parades and celebrations, to a grateful nation that honored their service. Vietnam veterans often returned to indifference or hostility. The war was unpopular. Many Americans opposed it and expressed their opposition by treating veterans badly. Stories of veterans being spat upon or called baby killers became part of the veteran mythology. Whether these specific incidents happened as often as claimed is debatable. But what is certain is that Vietnam veterans did not receive the hero's welcome that veterans of previous wars had received. They were told to take off their uniforms before leaving the airport, to not talk about their service, to just try to forget about Vietnam and move on with their lives. This lack of social support made it much harder for veterans to process their combat experiences. In previous wars, veterans could talk about what they had been through with family and friends who wanted to hear about it, who were proud of their service, who validated their experiences. Vietnam veterans often found that people did not want to hear about the war. Talking about Vietnam made people uncomfortable. Veterans learned to keep quiet, to not mention their service, to bury their experiences and try to forget. But trauma does not go away just because you do not talk about it. It festers and grows, emerging in nightmares and flashbacks and unexplained rage. The symptoms of what we now call PTSD were not unknown before Vietnam. Earlier wars had produced similar patterns of psychological distress. In World War I, it was called shell shock. In World War II and Korea, it was called combat fatigue or battle fatigue. But these conditions were generally understood as temporary reactions to combat stress that would resolve once the soldier was removed from combat and given rest. The idea that psychological trauma could produce lasting, chronic conditions that persisted for years or decades was not widely accepted in the medical community. When Vietnam veterans began showing up at Veterans Administration hospitals and clinics in the late 1960s and early 1970s with psychological problems, the VA was not prepared to help them. The mental health professionals at the VA did not understand what these veterans were experiencing. They tried to apply diagnoses and treatments that had been developed for other conditions, but these did not fit. Some veterans were told they had depression or anxiety disorders or personality disorders. Others were simply given medications to help them sleep or to calm their anxiety, without addressing the underlying trauma. Many veterans found the VA unhelpful and stopped seeking treatment. The veterans themselves often did not understand what was happening to them. They knew something was wrong, but they could not articulate it. They had nightmares, but everyone has nightmares sometimes. They were jumpy and irritable, but couldn't everyone be jumpy and irritable? They drank too much, but lots of people drank too much. They did not see their problems as a medical condition requiring treatment, but as personal failures, as weakness, as something to be ashamed of. This shame prevented many from seeking help and from talking about their struggles. The families of Vietnam veterans bore the brunt of their psychological problems. Wives found themselves living with men who were distant and uncommunicative, who exploded in anger at small provocations, who could not show affection or maintain intimate relationships. Children grew up with fathers who were emotionally absent, who frightened them with their rage, who could not engage with family life. Parents watched their sons, who had been normal young men before the war, struggle with problems they could not understand or fix. These family members suffered along with the veterans, casualties of a war they had not fought. The divorce rate among Vietnam veterans was significantly higher than among non-veterans of the same age. Marriages broke apart under the strain of trying to live with someone who was struggling with undiagnosed PTSD. Wives left, unable to cope with the drinking, the anger, the emotional distance. Some took the children with them. Some veterans, after their marriages fell apart, spiraled further downward, losing jobs, losing homes, ending up on the streets. The war continued to destroy lives years after the soldiers had left Vietnam. Unemployment and underemployment were common among Vietnam veterans with PTSD. They had difficulty holding jobs because of their symptoms. They could not concentrate. They could not deal with authority figures. They could not work in stressful environments. They had flashbacks or panic attacks that interfered with their ability to function. Employers, not understanding what was wrong, would fire them. The veterans would get another job, and the pattern would repeat. Some gave up trying to work and survived on disability payments or lived on the streets. The waste of human potential was enormous. Substance abuse was epidemic among Vietnam veterans, particularly those with PTSD. They drank to forget, to numb the pain, to help them sleep. They used marijuana, which many had first used in Vietnam, where it was readily available. Some used harder drugs, heroin, or other opiates, seeking oblivion. The substance abuse created additional problems, destroyed health, led to legal troubles, further alienated them from families and society. The self-medication approach to dealing with trauma, while understandable, was ultimately destructive and made recovery more difficult. Homelessness among Vietnam veterans became a visible social problem in the 1970s and 80s. Estimates varied, but it was clear that a disproportionate number of homeless people were Vietnam veterans. They lived under bridges, in abandoned buildings, on the streets. They panhandled or dug through trash for food. Some had been homeless for years, unable to function in society, unable to access the help they needed. Their visible presence in American cities was a reminder of the costs of war and of the failure to care for those who had served. Violence was another manifestation of PTSD among some Vietnam veterans. They had been trained to kill, had killed in Vietnam, and some brought that capacity for violence home with them. Domestic violence was common in veteran families. Some veterans were arrested for assault or other violent crimes. A few committed murders. The media sometimes sensationalized these cases, creating a stereotype of the Vietnam veteran as a dangerous, unstable person. This stereotype, while based on real incidents, was unfair to the vast majority of veterans who never became violent. But it contributed to the stigma that made it even harder for veterans to reintegrate into society. Suicide was the ultimate tragic outcome of untreated PTSD. Exact numbers are disputed and difficult to determine, but it is clear that Vietnam veterans committed suicide at rates significantly higher than the general population. Some committed suicide shortly after returning from Vietnam, unable to cope with the transition. Others lived for years or decades before finally succumbing to the pain and despair. The suicide rate among Vietnam veterans remains elevated even today. After the war ended, each suicide represents not just a life lost, but a failure to provide adequate care and support. The recognition that Vietnam veterans were suffering from a specific identifiable condition came slowly, and through the efforts of veterans themselves and of a few advocates within the medical community. In the 1970s, groups of Vietnam veterans began meeting informally to talk about their experiences and their struggles. These rap groups, as they were called, provided peer support and a place where veterans could talk honestly about what they were going through without fear of judgment. The veterans who participated in these groups began to recognize that their problems were similar, that they were not alone in what they were experiencing. Sarah Haley, a social worker who worked with Vietnam veterans, was one of the first mental health professionals to recognize that these veterans were suffering from a distinct condition related to their combat trauma. She wrote about what she was seeing and argued that the existing diagnostic categories did not adequately describe or address the veterans' problems. Her work, and the work of other clinicians and researchers, began to build the case for recognizing post-traumatic stress as a distinct disorder. The American Psychiatric Association, which publishes the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the standard reference for psychiatric diagnoses, was resistant at first to creating a new diagnosis for combat-related trauma. But advocacy by veterans groups, by clinicians working with veterans, and by researchers who were documenting the prevalence and severity of trauma-related symptoms eventually prevailed. In 1980, the third edition of the DSM included for the first time a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. This was a watershed moment in the recognition and treatment of trauma. The diagnostic criteria for PTSD, as defined in 1980, included several key elements. First, there had to be a traumatic event, a stressor outside the range of normal human experience that would be distressing to almost anyone. For combat veterans, the traumatic events were their combat experiences. Second, there had to be persistent re-experiencing of the traumatic event through intrusive memories, nightmares, or flashbacks. Third, there had to be avoidance of stimuli associated with the trauma and numbing of general responsiveness. Fourth, there had to be persistent symptoms of increased arousal such as difficulty sleeping, irritability, hypervigilance, or exaggerated startle response. These symptoms had to persist for more than a month and had to cause significant distress or impairment in functioning. This diagnostic definition finally gave veterans and clinicians a framework for understanding what many Vietnam veterans were experiencing. It validated that their symptoms were real, were related to their combat trauma, and constituted a medical condition deserving of treatment. It meant that veterans could seek treatment specifically for PTSD rather than being misdiagnosed with other conditions. and it meant that research could be conducted on the prevalence, causes, and treatment of PTSD with a common definition that allowed comparison across studies. The recognition of PTSD as a diagnosis did not immediately solve the problems facing Vietnam veterans. Many still did not seek treatment because of stigma, or because they did not know treatment was available. The VA, while it began to offer PTSD treatment programs, was not adequately resourced to meet the need. Wait times for treatment were long. The quality of treatment was inconsistent. Many veterans fell through the cracks, never receiving the help they needed. But the recognition of PTSD was a crucial first step toward addressing the invisible wounds of war. To understand why Vietnam veterans developed PTSD at such high rates and why the condition was so severe and long-lasting for many, we must delve deeper into the nature of trauma and how it affects the human mind and brain. Post-traumatic stress disorder is not a sign of weakness or a character flaw. It is a normal response of the human nervous system to abnormal and overwhelming experiences. When human beings are exposed to events that threaten death or serious injury, that overwhelm our ability to cope, that shatter our assumptions about safety and order in the world, our minds and bodies respond in ways that can persist long after the immediate threat has passed. The human brain has evolved to respond to danger with a fight-or-flight response. When we perceive a threat, our brain's alarm system, centered in an area called the amygdala, triggers a cascade of physiological responses. Stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol flood the bloodstream. Heart rate and blood pressure increase. Blood flow shifts from the digestive system to the muscles. Our senses become hyperacute. We become focused on the immediate threat to the exclusion of everything else. This response evolved to help our ancestors survive encounters with predators or enemies. It is adaptive in the short term, helping us fight or flee from danger. But when the threat is prolonged or repeated, when there is no escape from danger, when the fight-or-flight response is activated over and over without resolution, the system can become dysregulated. The alarm system becomes hypersensitive, triggering even when there is no actual threat. The stress response becomes chronic, with persistently elevated stress hormones that damage the body over time. The brain's normal mechanisms for processing and storing memories are overwhelmed, leading to fragmented traumatic memories that intrude into consciousness as flashbacks and nightmares. For Vietnam veterans, the constant danger of combat, the repeated exposure to life-threatening situations, the inability to fight or flee effectively against an often invisible enemy, all combine to create ideal conditions for the development of PTSD. The traumatic experiences were not single events, but ongoing, accumulating over months. The soldiers could not escape. They had to endure. And their nervous systems, designed to handle acute stress but not chronic stress, became overwhelmed and dysregulated. The specific symptoms of PTSD can be understood as the nervous system's attempts to cope with trauma that it cannot process normally. Intrusive memories and flashbacks occur because traumatic memories are not stored in the brain the same way that normal memories are stored. Normal memories are integrated into our life narrative, stored with context and time markers, recalled voluntarily when we choose to remember something. Traumatic memories are fragmented and encoded differently, often with intense sensory and emotional components, but without the normal narrative structure. They intrude into consciousness unbidden, triggered by sights, sounds, smells, or other stimuli that resemble some aspect of the traumatic event. A Vietnam veteran might hear a helicopter and suddenly be back in Vietnam, feeling the same fear and adrenaline surge he felt during a combat mission. The sound triggers a traumatic memory that feels not like a memory, but like it is happening now. The veteran might rationally know he is safe, but his body and brain are responding as if he is in danger. This is a flashback, a dissociative experience where the boundaries between past and present collapse. Flashbacks can be terrifying both for the person experiencing them and for those around them. Nightmares serve a similar function, the brain attempting to process traumatic material during sleep but unable to do so effectively. Vietnam veterans with PTSD often report recurring nightmares about combat, about watching friends die, about being unable to save others, about making terrible moral choices. They wake from these nightmares in a state of terror, heart pounding, covered in sweat. sometimes crying out or thrashing. The nightmares can be so distressing that veterans become afraid to sleep, leading to chronic sleep deprivation that exacerbates all other symptoms. Avoidance behaviors, another cardinal symptom of PTSD, represent the attempt to prevent traumatic memories from being triggered. Veterans avoid situations, people, or places that remind them of Vietnam. They avoid watching war movies or news about war. They avoid crowds because crowds are unpredictable and potentially dangerous. They avoid intimate relationships because intimacy requires vulnerability and trust, things that trauma destroys. This avoidance may provide short-term relief from distressing memories and emotions, but it also restricts the veteran's life, cutting them off from experiences and relationships that could be healing. Emotional numbing, the inability to feel pleasure or to connect emotionally with others, is another way the traumatized brain tries to protect itself. If you cannot feel anything, then you cannot feel pain, but you also cannot feel joy or love or connection. Veterans with this symptom describe feeling dead inside, going through the motions of life but not really living. They cannot engage with their children or spouses. They cannot enjoy activities that used to bring pleasure. They are emotionally isolated even when surrounded by people who love them. Hyperarousal, the state of constant alertness and readiness for danger, made sense in Vietnam, where danger was constant. But when it persists back in the United States, where actual danger is rare, it becomes debilitating. Veterans with hyperarousal startle easily at loud noises. They cannot relax. They need to sit with their backs to the wall where they can see all exits. They sleep lightly and wake at the slightest sound. They are irritable and quick to anger because their nervous systems are always on edge. This state of constant arousal is exhausting and makes it difficult to function in normal life. The moral injury component of combat trauma, while not originally part of the PTSD diagnosis, has been increasingly recognized as an important factor, particularly for Vietnam veterans. Moral injury occurs when someone does something, or fails to do something, or witnesses something that violates their deeply held moral beliefs. In combat, soldiers are sometimes forced to kill in ways that trouble their conscience. They may kill civilians accidentally, or in ambiguous situations where it is not clear who is enemy and who is innocent. They may fail to save a wounded comrade. They may follow orders they believe are wrong. These experiences create moral distress that can be as damaging as the fear and horror of combat. Many Vietnam veterans struggled with moral injury related to the nature of the war they fought. The war was morally ambiguous in ways that previous American wars had not been. It was not clear that the enemy were the bad guys and the Americans the good guys. The South Vietnamese government the Americans were defending was corrupt and often brutal. American military tactics sometimes killed innocent civilians. Veterans who had participated in or witnessed atrocities, or who simply questioned whether the war was just, carried moral burdens that contributed to their psychological distress. The My Lai massacre and similar incidents, whether veterans were directly involved or simply knew about them, created moral injury for many. Even veterans who never committed atrocities themselves sometimes felt tainted by association, felt that the war had made them complicit in things they found morally abhorrent. This moral injury was harder to treat than the fear-based symptoms of PTSD because it involved questions of guilt and responsibility that could not be resolved simply by learning to manage anxiety and traumatic memories. The biological basis of PTSD has been increasingly well understood through research over the past several decades. Studies using brain imaging technologies have shown that PTSD involves changes in brain structure and function. The amygdala, the brain's alarm system, is hyperactive in people with PTSD, responding to stimuli that should not trigger alarm. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain involved in rational thought and in regulating emotional responses, shows decreased activity in people with PTSD. The hippocampus, involved in memory formation and in distinguishing past from present, is often smaller in people with PTSD. These brain changes help explain the symptoms and suggest targets for treatment. The hormonal changes in PTSD have also been documented. People with PTSD often have dysregulation of the stress hormone system, with alterations in cortisol levels and in the body's ability to return to baseline after stress. These hormonal changes have widespread effects on the body, affecting the immune system, the cardiovascular system, metabolism, and many other physiological processes. The chronic stress associated with PTSD contributes to increased rates of physical health problems, including heart disease, diabetes, and autoimmune disorders. The genetic and developmental factors that influence who develops PTSD and how severe it is have also been studied. Not everyone who experiences trauma develops PTSD. Some people are more resilient, able to cope with traumatic experiences without developing chronic symptoms. Others are more vulnerable. Genetic factors play a role, with some genes associated with increased risk for PTSD. Childhood experiences also matter. People who experienced abuse or other trauma as children are more likely to develop PTSD after adult trauma. The attachment relationships we form in childhood affect our ability to regulate emotions and to seek social support, which in turn affects how we respond to trauma. For Vietnam veterans, the lack of social support upon returning home was a major factor in the development and persistence of PTSD. Social support is one of the most important protective factors against developing PTSD after trauma. When traumatized people have others who listen to them, who validate their experiences, who provide practical and emotional support, they are more likely to recover. Vietnam veterans often lacked this social support. They came home to a country that did not want to hear about the war, to families who did not understand what they had been through, to communities where they felt isolated and different. This lack of support allowed PTSD to take root and persist. The delayed onset of PTSD symptoms in some veterans was puzzling at first, but is now better understood. Some veterans seemed fine for months or years after returning from Vietnam, then suddenly developed symptoms. This delayed onset can occur because people sometimes use avoidance and emotional numbing so effectively that they suppress symptoms for extended periods. But this suppression requires constant effort and eventually becomes unsustainable. Symptoms break through when defenses are weakened by stress, by substance use, by life changes, or simply by the accumulated weight of carrying unprocessed trauma for years. The comorbidity of PTSD with other mental health conditions was high among Vietnam veterans. Many veterans with PTSD also had depression, anxiety disorders, or substance use disorders. These conditions often developed as consequences of the PTSD. Depression resulted from the chronic stress, the social isolation, the loss of ability to experience pleasure, and the feelings of hopelessness that accompany PTSD. Anxiety disorders developed from the hyperarousal and the sense of danger that pervaded the veteran's life. Substance use disorders developed from attempts to self-medicate the symptoms of PTSD and the other conditions. Treating these comorbid conditions along with the PTSD was and is crucial for recovery. The development of effective treatments for PTSD has been one of the positive legacies of the Vietnam War and its aftermath. The recognition that trauma produces specific psychological symptoms that require specific treatments led to research and clinical innovation that has benefited not just combat veterans, but trauma survivors of all kinds. The treatments developed for Vietnam veterans with PTSD are now used to treat survivors of sexual assault, childhood abuse, natural disasters, terrorist attacks, and many other forms of trauma. The first treatments for PTSD were developed through trial and error by clinicians working with Vietnam veterans. Early approaches focused on providing a safe space where veterans could talk about their experiences, on peer support groups where veterans could connect with others who had been through similar trauma, and on helping veterans develop coping skills for managing their symptoms. These early interventions, while not based on rigorous research, were often helpful. They provided validation, reduced isolation, and gave veterans tools for managing distressing symptoms. The Veterans Administration, despite its many shortcomings in the early response to the PTSD crisis, eventually became a leader in PTSD research and treatment. Specialized PTSD clinics were established at VA medical centers around the country. These clinics offered individual and group therapy specifically designed for trauma survivors. They employed therapists trained in evidence-based treatments. They conducted research to evaluate what treatments worked and to develop new and better approaches. The VA's commitment to PTSD treatment, while it came later than it should have, represented a recognition of the obligation to care for those who had been harmed by their military service. One of the most important developments was the recognition that simply talking about trauma, while potentially helpful, was not sufficient for many people with severe PTSD. Some forms of therapy that encourage detailed discussion of traumatic events could actually make symptoms worse if not done carefully. This led to the development of specialized trauma-focused therapies that helped people process traumatic memories in ways that reduced their power to cause distress. Prolonged exposure therapy, developed by psychologist Edna Foa, is one such treatment. This therapy involves having the person with PTSD repeatedly revisit their traumatic memories in a safe, controlled environment. Through repeated exposure to the memories without the actual danger being present, the emotional intensity of the memories decreases. The person learns that remembering the trauma is not dangerous, that they can tolerate the distress, and gradually the memories lose their power. Prolonged exposure has been shown in multiple research studies to be effective for PTSD, including among combat veterans. Cognitive processing therapy, developed by Patricia Resick, focuses on the thoughts and beliefs that trauma creates. People with PTSD often develop beliefs that the world is completely dangerous, that they are helpless, that they cannot be trusted, or that the trauma was their fault. These beliefs are called stuck points, and they maintain the symptoms of PTSD. Cognitive processing therapy helps people identify these stuck points and examine whether they are accurate. Through a structured process, people learn to develop more balanced and accurate ways of thinking about themselves and their trauma. This therapy has also been shown to be effective in research studies. Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or EMDR, developed by Francine Shapiro, is another trauma-focused therapy that has become widely used. In EMDR, the person recalls traumatic memories while simultaneously engaging in bilateral stimulation, typically by following a therapist's finger, moving back and forth, or through alternating auditory or tactile stimulation. The theory is that this bilateral stimulation helps the brain process traumatic memories that have been stored in a dysfunctional way. While the exact mechanism is debated, research has shown that EMDR can be effective for reducing PTSD symptoms. Medications have also played a role in PTSD treatment, though they are generally seen as adjuncts to therapy rather than as primary treatments. Antidepressant medications, particularly selective serotonin, reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs, can help reduce some PTSD symptoms, including depression, anxiety, and hyperarousal. They do not cure PTSD, but can make symptoms more manageable, allowing people to participate more effectively in therapy and to function better in daily life. Some veterans have benefited significantly from medications, while others have found them unhelpful or have experienced unacceptable side effects. The importance of addressing substance use disorders in veterans with PTSD has been increasingly recognized. Many veterans used alcohol or drugs to cope with their symptoms, and these substance use disorders became additional problems requiring treatment. Treating PTSD without addressing the substance use often leads to relapse, as the veteran returns to using substances to manage still present PTSD symptoms. Integrated treatments that address both PTSD and substance use simultaneously have been developed and have shown promise. Peer support has remained an important component of PTSD treatment. Many veterans find it helpful to connect with other veterans who understand what they have been through. Veteran peer support groups, whether formal groups run by the VA or informal groups organized by veterans themselves, provide a space where experiences can be shared, where struggles can be discussed without judgment, and where practical advice about coping can be exchanged. The sense of connection and shared understanding that comes from peer support can be profoundly healing. Family therapy and couples therapy have also been important for many veterans with PTSD. The condition affects not just the veteran, but everyone around them. Spouses and children need education about PTSD to understand what their loved one is experiencing. They need skills for supporting the veteran's recovery, while also maintaining their own well-being. They need to process their own trauma from living with someone with PTSD. Family-focused treatments can help repair damaged relationships and can strengthen the family as a resource for the veteran's recovery. Alternative and complementary approaches to PTSD treatment have also been explored. Yoga, meditation, and mindfulness practices have been shown to help some veterans manage their symptoms. These practices focus on body awareness, on regulating the nervous system, and on learning to be present in the moment rather than trapped in traumatic memories. Art therapy, music therapy, and other creative approaches have helped some veterans express and process trauma that is difficult to put into words. Spending time in nature, working with animals, and other activities that promote calm and connection have also been beneficial for some. Despite the availability of effective treatments, many Vietnam veterans with PTSD never received adequate treatment. Barriers to treatment were numerous. The stigma associated with mental illness made many veterans reluctant to seek help. They saw asking for help as a sign of weakness. They feared being judged or not being believed. They worried that a mental health diagnosis would affect their employment or their standing in their communities. These concerns kept many veterans from seeking treatment even when they were suffering. Practical barriers also existed. VA facilities were not always accessible, particularly for veterans living in rural areas. Wait times for appointments were often long, sometimes months. The quality of care was inconsistent, with some VA facilities providing excellent PTSD treatment and others providing minimal or ineffective services. Veterans who had bad experiences with the VA sometimes gave up on seeking treatment. Some sought treatment in the private sector, but struggled to find therapists who understood combat trauma and who knew how to treat PTSD effectively. The recovery process for Vietnam veterans with PTSD has been long and difficult. PTSD is a chronic condition for many. While treatment can reduce symptoms and improve functioning, complete cure is not always possible. Many veterans have learned to manage their PTSD, to use coping skills and to avoid triggers, to maintain some level of functionality, even while continuing to struggle with symptoms. Recovery is measured not in the complete absence of symptoms, but in the ability to live a meaningful life despite them. For some veterans, recovery has involved finding purpose and meaning through helping others. Many have become advocates for fellow veterans, working with veterans organizations, volunteering at VA facilities, or simply being there for other veterans who are struggling. This service to others has given their own suffering meaning and has been healing for them, turning pain into purpose, transforming the trauma of Vietnam into motivation to help others, has been a path to recovery for many. The impact of Vietnam veterans with PTSD on their families has been profound and long-lasting. Children who grew up with fathers who had PTSD often experienced their own trauma. They dealt with fathers who were emotionally distant, who were frightening in their rages, who were unpredictable. These children often developed their own mental health problems, including anxiety, depression, and difficulties with relationships. The trauma of war was transmitted across generations, affecting people who had never set foot in Vietnam. Some adult children of Vietnam veterans have worked to understand their fathers' experiences and to build relationships with them, despite the difficulties. This process of understanding and reconciliation has been healing for both veterans and their children. Other families have been unable to bridge the gaps, and estrangement has persisted. The casualties of Vietnam extended far beyond those who served, encompassing families and communities affected by the psychological wounds veterans carried home. The broader social impact of the PTSD crisis among Vietnam veterans has shaped how American society thinks about war, about veterans, and about mental health. The visible suffering of Vietnam veterans, the homelessness and substance abuse and broken lives, served as a powerful anti-war message. It made clear that war has costs that extend far beyond battlefield casualties, that sending young people to war creates obligations that persist for their entire lives. This awareness has influenced debates about subsequent American military involvements. The recognition of PTSD as a legitimate medical condition, driven largely by the experiences of Vietnam veterans, has had implications far beyond veterans. The understanding that psychological trauma can produce lasting changes in the brain and behavior, that these changes constitute a medical condition rather than a character flaw, has helped reduce stigma around mental health issues more broadly. The treatments developed for PTSD are now used to treat trauma survivors of many types, saving and improving countless lives. The ongoing research into PTSD, much of it supported by the VA and focused on veteran populations, continues to advance understanding of trauma and its effects. Studies of the neurobiology of PTSD, of genetic and environmental risk factors, of treatment mechanisms, all contribute to knowledge that benefits trauma survivors everywhere. The Vietnam veterans who have participated in this research, who have allowed themselves to be studied in the hopes of helping others, have made important contributions to science and medicine. The cultural legacy of Vietnam veterans with PTSD is visible in movies, books, and other artistic works. Films like The Deer Hunter, Coming Home, Born on the 4th of July, and many others have portrayed the struggles of Vietnam veterans. These portrayals have sometimes been accurate and sensitive, other times sensationalized or stereotypical. But they have kept the issue in the public consciousness, have educated people about PTSD, and have contributed to greater understanding of what veterans experience. The political activism of Vietnam, veterans around PTSD, and other veterans issues has been significant. Veterans organizations have lobbied Congress for better funding for VA mental health services, for research into PTSD and other conditions affecting veterans, for benefits for disabled veterans. Vietnam veterans have testified before Congress, sharing their experiences and advocating for policy changes. This advocacy has led to improvements in how veterans are treated, though advocates argue that much more needs to be done. The comparison between how Vietnam veterans were treated and how veterans of more recent wars are treated shows both progress and persistent problems. After the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, there has been greater awareness of PTSD and other mental health issues affecting veterans. Screening for PTSD is more routine. Treatment is more readily available. The stigma has been somewhat reduced. These improvements are partly the result of lessons learned from the Vietnam experience, but problems remain. Wait times for VA mental health services are still too long. Suicide rates among veterans remain elevated. Many veterans still do not receive the treatment they need. The lessons of Vietnam have been learned in some ways, but not fully applied. The question of prevention, of how to reduce the incidence of PTSD among combat veterans, has received increasing attention. Some of the risk factors for PTSD cannot be changed. Combat will always be traumatic. People will always be exposed to death and violence in war, but some factors can be addressed. Unit cohesion helps protect against PTSD. Soldiers who serve with the same unit, who bond with their comrades, who deploy and return together, cope better with combat stress than those who serve in constantly changing units or who rotate individually. The military has moved away from individual rotation systems, partly in recognition of this. Leadership quality also matters. Soldiers who serve under competent, caring leaders who look out for their welfare cope better with combat stress than those who serve under incompetent or abusive leaders. Training leaders to recognize and respond to combat stress in their soldiers, to create units where seeking help is not stigmatized, to model healthy coping, all help reduce PTSD. The military has invested more in leadership training around these issues, though implementation remains inconsistent. The meaning and purpose that soldiers find in their service affects their psychological resilience. Soldiers who believe in the mission, who feel their service is valued and important, who see clear objectives being achieved, cope better than those who question why they are fighting or who feel their sacrifices are pointless. This was a major problem in Vietnam, where many soldiers did not understand or believe in the mission, where the strategic objectives were unclear, where the sense of purpose was often absent. Creating clear, achievable objectives and ensuring that soldiers understand and believe in what they are fighting for is important for psychological health. The transition home from combat needs to be better managed. The rapid transition that Vietnam veterans experienced, leaving combat and arriving home within days with no preparation or decompression, was harmful. More recent deployments have included transition periods where soldiers are pulled out of combat, given time to rest and begin processing their experiences, and prepared for returning home. These transition periods help, but are still often too brief. More could be done to prepare soldiers and their families for the challenges of homecoming and to provide support during the critical period of readjustment. Screening for PTSD symptoms soon after return from combat allows for early intervention. Many service members develop symptoms in the weeks and months after returning from deployment. If these symptoms are identified early and treated promptly, the development of chronic PTSD can sometimes be prevented. The military and VA have implemented screening programs, but follow-through on positive screens is inconsistent. Many service members who screen positive for PTSD symptoms do not receive timely treatment. The role of resilience training, teaching psychological skills before deployment that may help service members cope with combat stress, has been explored. Programs teaching stress management, emotional regulation, problem solving, and other skills have been implemented with the goal of preventing PTSD. The effectiveness of these programs is still being evaluated, but the concept of psychological preparation for combat trauma makes sense and shows promise. Despite all these prevention efforts, PTSD will likely remain a significant issue for combat veterans. War is traumatic. No amount of preparation or support can completely eliminate the psychological impact of killing and risking death, of seeing friends killed, of witnessing suffering and destruction. What can be done is to minimize the risk factors, maximize the protective factors, identify problems early, and provide effective treatment promptly. The goal is not to eliminate PTSD entirely, but to reduce its prevalence and severity, and to ensure that all who develop it receive the help they need. The ethical obligations that American society has to veterans with PTSD are clear. These individuals served their country. They did what their government asked them to do. They were sent into situations that caused them psychological harm. Society has an obligation to provide them with the best possible care, to support them and their families, to honor their service even when acknowledging that the war they fought was controversial. This obligation is moral and practical. Meeting it is the right thing to do, and also serves the national interest by ensuring that future generations will be willing to serve. The cost of providing adequate PTSD treatment and support for veterans is substantial, but is dwarfed by the cost of not providing it. Veterans with untreated PTSD cost society in many ways. They are more likely to be unemployed or underemployed, reducing tax revenue and economic productivity. They are more likely to be homeless, creating costs for emergency services and social programs. They are more likely to have physical health problems, generating healthcare costs. They are more likely to be incarcerated, generating criminal justice costs. They are more likely to die by suicide, representing the ultimate waste of human potential. Investing in effective treatment is not just morally right, but economically sensible. The stories of recovery and resilience among Vietnam veterans with PTSD are inspiring and instructive. Many veterans who struggled for years or decades have eventually found peace and stability. They have participated in treatment, have built or rebuilt relationships with family, have found purpose in work or volunteer activities, have learned to manage their symptoms and to live meaningful lives. Their stories show that recovery is possible, that trauma need not be a life sentence, that with help and support, people can heal from even the worst experiences. One such story is that of Max Cleland, who lost both legs and an arm in Vietnam and also struggled with PTSD and depression. Cleland went on to serve as a U.S. Senator and as head of the Veterans Administration. He became an advocate for veterans and used his own experience to inform policy. His recovery and success did not erase his trauma or his losses, but he found meaning and purpose despite them. His story represents hope for veterans who are still struggling. Another is the story of Carl Marlantes, a Marine officer who fought in some of the most intense combat of the war and struggled for decades with PTSD and moral injury. Marlantes eventually wrote novels and memoirs about his experiences, processing his trauma through writing and helping others understand what combat veterans experience. His book, What It Is Like to Go to War, is a profound meditation on combat trauma and moral injury. His recovery involved confronting his experiences, understanding them, and finding meaning in sharing what he learned. Many other veterans have found recovery through helping fellow veterans. They volunteer at VA hospitals, work for veterans organizations, facilitate peer support groups, or simply make themselves available to other veterans who need someone to talk to. This service transforms their own suffering into something that helps others, giving their pain purpose. The generativity of helping the next generation of veterans has been healing for many Vietnam veterans with PTSD. The spiritual dimension of recovery from combat trauma has been important for many veterans. Some have found healing through religious faith, through prayer, and participation in religious communities. Others have found spiritual meaning outside traditional religion, through connection with nature, through meditation and mindfulness practices, or through philosophical exploration of meaning and purpose. The existential questions raised by combat, questions about death and suffering and the meaning of life, often cannot be answered through therapy alone. Many veterans have needed to grapple with these questions on a spiritual level to find peace. Forgiveness, both of oneself and of others, has been an important part of recovery for some veterans. Many carry guilt about things they did or did not do in Vietnam, about comrades they could not save, about people they killed, about moral compromises they made. Learning to forgive themselves, to accept that they did the best they could under impossible circumstances, has been essential for letting go of the burden of guilt. Some have also needed to forgive leaders who sent them to war, a country that did not support them when they came home, or even former enemies. This forgiveness does not mean forgetting or excusing, but rather releasing the hold that resentment and blame have on one's life. The creative arts have provided another path to healing for some veterans. Writing, painting, music, theater, and other artistic expressions have allowed veterans to process and communicate their experiences. The trauma that is difficult to talk about in ordinary language can sometimes be expressed through art. Creating something from the raw material of trauma can be transformative. Many veterans have discovered talents they did not know they had, and have found meaning and identity through artistic creation. Physical activity and connection with nature have been therapeutic for many veterans. Hiking, fishing, hunting, working outdoors, all provide ways to calm the nervous system, to be present in the moment, to find peace in natural settings. Some veterans have found that physical challenges, like climbing mountains or running marathons, give them goals to work toward and help them feel capable and strong. Programs that take veterans into wilderness settings for therapeutic purposes have shown promising results. The importance of continuing the conversation about PTSD and combat trauma cannot be overstated. Every generation of veterans faces these issues. The experiences of Vietnam veterans provide knowledge and perspective that can help current and future veterans. Maintaining institutions and programs that support veterans with PTSD, continuing research into better treatments, preserving the stories of those who have struggled and recovered, all are essential tasks. The work begun by Vietnam veterans to bring attention to PTSD must continue. The broader lesson of the Vietnam veteran PTSD experience is about the true costs of war. When political leaders decide to send military forces into combat, they are making decisions that will affect thousands or millions of lives, not just during the conflict, but for decades afterward. The costs of war include not just those killed and physically wounded, but also those who carry invisible wounds for the rest of their lives, the families affected, the society that must provide care and support. These costs must be honestly acknowledged and factored into decisions about when and how to use military force. The Vietnam War created a generation of veterans scarred by PTSD. More than 2 million Americans served in Vietnam. Estimates suggest that between 500,000 and 1 million developed PTSD at some point after their service. Even now, more than 50 years after the war ended, many Vietnam veterans continue to struggle with PTSD symptoms. They are aging, dealing with the physical ailments of older age alongside the psychological wounds of war. Providing care for this aging population of traumatized veterans remains a challenge and a moral obligation. The children and grandchildren of Vietnam veterans carry forward the legacy of that war. Some have followed their fathers into military service, seeking to understand what their fathers experienced or to honor their service. Others have dedicated themselves to peace activism, determined to prevent future generations from experiencing what their fathers went through. Still others simply carry the family history, the knowledge that war's effects ripple across generations, shaping lives in ways both subtle and profound. The memorial wall in Washington, D.C., with the names of more than 58,000 Americans who died in Vietnam, represents the most visible cost of that war. But if there were a wall listing all those who came home from Vietnam and later died from suicide, from substance abuse, from the indirect effects of untreated PTSD, it would be much longer. These invisible casualties of war deserve to be remembered and honored along with those who died in combat. They too gave their lives for their country, just more slowly and far from the battlefield. The Vietnam Women's Memorial in Washington honors the women who served in Vietnam, most of them nurses who treated the wounded and dying. Many of these women also developed PTSD from their experiences. They witnessed terrible suffering, held dying young men, dealt with the trauma of combat medicine under primitive conditions. Their PTSD was often unrecognized for even longer than that of male veterans because the assumption was that only those in direct combat developed PTSD. The recognition that exposure to trauma, even in a caregiving role, can cause PTSD was partly the result of research with Vietnam nurse veterans. The ongoing effort to achieve reconciliation between the United States and Vietnam has been complicated by the legacy of the war, including the PTSD that affects both American and Vietnamese veterans. Vietnamese veterans, both from the North and from the South, also suffer from trauma. The Vietnamese people as a whole carry the trauma of a war that killed millions and devastated their country. True reconciliation requires acknowledging this mutual suffering and finding ways to honor the humanity of all who were affected by the war. Some American veterans have returned to Vietnam decades after the war, seeking to come to terms with their experiences, to see the country at peace, to meet former enemies as fellow human beings. These returns can be healing, helping veterans integrate their traumatic experiences into a broader understanding that includes the Vietnamese perspective. They see that Vietnam has rebuilt, that life has continued, that the country they remember as a war zone is now a place where people live normal lives. This broader perspective can help reduce the hold that traumatic memories have. The field of traumatic stress studies, which examines how humans respond to extreme experiences, has been profoundly shaped by research with Vietnam veterans. Much of what is known about PTSD, about trauma and memory, about effective treatments, comes from studies involving Vietnam veterans. These veterans, by participating in research, by sharing their experiences, by allowing researchers to study their brains and their symptoms, have contributed to knowledge that benefits millions of trauma survivors worldwide. This is part of their legacy. The challenge going forward is to ensure that the lessons learned from the Vietnam veteran PTSD experience are not forgotten. Each new generation of veterans faces the risk of combat trauma. Each new war creates thousands who will struggle with invisible wounds. The systems and knowledge developed to help Vietnam veterans must be maintained and improved. The commitment to caring for those who serve must be renewed with each generation. The true cost of war, including the long-term psychological costs, must be honestly acknowledged. The story of Vietnam veterans and PTSD is not over. Thousands of these veterans are still alive, many still struggling with symptoms, even in their 70s and 80s. Their needs for care and support continue. Research continues into better treatments, into understanding the long-term effects of PTSD, into helping aging veterans cope with their condition. The story will continue until the last Vietnam veteran is gone, and even then, the legacy will persist in the knowledge gained, in the treatments developed, in the awareness created about the psychological costs of war. For those who served in Vietnam and who have struggled with PTSD, the message must be one of recognition and gratitude. Your service was real. Your suffering was real. Your wounds, though invisible, were as significant as any physical injury. You deserve better than you received when you came home. But through your struggles, through your participation in research and treatment, through your advocacy, you have helped change how trauma is understood and treated. You have helped countless others who have suffered trauma. Your legacy is not just your service in Vietnam, but your contribution to healing trauma in all its forms. You are not forgotten. Your suffering was not in vain, and there is still hope for healing, for peace, for living a life with meaning and purpose despite the wounds of war.